Hello there, sword friends. Today I'm going to tell you about this sword right here. This is the Spring Sakura Katana, the new revised, differentially hardened version from Dragon King. And before I get into this video, I do want to tell you a couple quick caveats and disclaimers. One, this is a review sample. It was sent to me for free from the folks at Cast Iberia to perform this review. And that is worth knowing. I didn't spend any money on it. If you think that makes me biased, you know at the start. You should also know I do study Japanese swordsmanship. I've done so for a while. I don't fancy myself an expert, but if you see me move it around and I look good or clumsy, that might be why. The other bit that you should know is that years ago, I reviewed this sword already, or rather the previous iteration, and I've had two of their through-hardened counterpart swords, or the original version of this sword. So I have reviewed it already. This one is a revisit. Now, I've since sold those or traded them or done whatever I do with them. I don't think I broke them. Anyway, I don't have them anymore, so I can't exactly compare them, but I can recall some of my original thoughts on the sword, and they're on YouTube. I'll link it in the description down below if you're interested. But anyway, that's the caveats and disclaimers that you should know. I'm going to go through this review. I'm going to let you know, first off, this is $600 on Dragon King's website, but you can find it on Cult of Athena or distributors for around $450, $500 somewhere in there is probably about where you can find it. Now, that is not an inexpensive sword, but it's also not the most expensive sword. So it's somewhere towards the still entry level or budget price point, but kind of drifting into the middle tier of swords. And there's a lot of different swords that you can get around the $500 price point. I'm saying $500, that's what I'm considering it as, because you can buy one brand new for that money from an authorized distributor with a warranty and yada, yada, yada. So anyway, as I think of, is it worth it? I'm going to be thinking about it in comparison to other $500 swords that I have had, tested, used, etc., etc. And I'm also going to be thinking about how much has it improved? How much more do I like this version in comparison to the one that I had years ago? Anyway, that's the gist. I'm going to go through bits and bobs, fits and features, and I'm going to do some usage of practice Iaido with it, move it around, talk about that. I'll do some cutting as well. And then I will give you my thoughts and opinions on if I think it is worth it or not. You may have noticed I omitted something in here. I'm not going to break it. And that's one thing that is becoming a trend here. This is a differentially hardened variety of a sword, and it's not going to hold up super well. And I don't mean that in the sense that it's not a durable sword. I just mean that it's differentially hardened. And if I go and use the sword, I'll push it, I'll abuse it a little bit. But I'm not going to intentionally take it to the croquet stake of doom, because the edge is going to chip and then it's going to break in half relatively quickly. And that seems to just be the nature of differentially hardened katana. This one isn't made to be a piece of garbage, but it's also not made to be some sort of super steel, some sort of crazy thing. It's meant to do normal dojo use kind of stuff. So that's what I'm going to try to do with it. If it fails along the way, then so be it. But I'm not going to intentionally try to break it, and that's also worth calling out. So anyway, on with the bits and bobs and fits and features section of this video. Then the first thing I'm going to talk about is the kashra, the end cap right here. And what we have is what reminds me of basically a recast or patinaed version of a shibuichi kashra. Shibuichi is an alloy of silver and copper, as I understand it, and I have seen it, when done really well, give this kind of dull gray-green kind of color, and that's a little bit what this one is mirroring. It could just be iron, but I like the patina on it. I haven't used this a lot, but I have used it over the last few months, and it hasn't rubbed off either. I imagine it will with time. That's pretty common if you're using your sword a lot for practice. But basically, it's a long-winded way of saying I like the color. The shirodome in here, these little washers on the side are placed in. They do appear to be separate. Oftentimes, simple fittings like this on budget-ended swords are cast into the fitting, and they're not actually a separate piece. So this is a good sign. Nicer manufacturers tend to do this with the swords. I'm happy to see Dragon King doing it as well. The general look of the kashra as well is nice. It's not super complicated. A lot of times in $500 swords, or just swords in general, I guess, they tend to really be very ambitious with the kind of fittings they're putting on, with all sorts of gold detailing and stuff like that. And it takes on too much and gets muddy, and that's not what this sword is about. It has a relatively simple kashra, but at the same time, it's rounded and ovoid and has, some grooves on it. It's more complex than just a simple cast fitting. At the same time, it's not overly ambitious for a sword that's still in the budget territory, and it pulls off what it's setting off to do. It's even. I don't make out any casting lines or imperfections or blemishes. There's no hot spots on it. As a general practitioner's kashra that's simple and pleasant to look at, it's doing a very solid job. I would also point out something that I don't recall the previous Dragon King sword doing well, and that is these transitions. It's fit really, really well. Oftentimes, even on swords in this $500 price point, which is kind of creeping up into the middle-end territory, they get bunchy and the ito isn't tied particularly well. This is tied exceptionally well. It has very clean, nice transitions. The knots don't stand out, very proud, and nothing is bunchy or ugly here, and the kasha has stayed on. I've used this some at this point in the recording of this review, and nothing is loosened. I've done some quasi-abusive things with it already. I've done some bad cuts, and everything is still right and tight. It's also worth noting that I've practiced with it in very, very cold temperatures, and it is still on there. Sometimes they loosen up or crack, or the adhesive diminishes that's holding this on. It should just be tight with the ito as it's tied, but there's usually some adhesive on here as well, and oftentimes that diminishes in the very cold Minnesota weather that I live in. Everything is doing what it's supposed to be doing on the kasha, and it's a very good sign for the rest of the sword. So I'm going to move on from there, and I'm going to talk about the handle. I'm going to start with the ito. It's this bright red. It's a cherry blossom theme, and I think the cherry blossom color is really appropriate here. It's a very handsome sword in general, and I think thematically things work really well here, but I'll talk about that in a moment. It's red ito. The red tends to be a color that bleeds into, pun intended there, I guess. It tends to be a color that bleeds into things, but I haven't noticed any of the staining on my hands when I use it. If my hands get wet from like placing tatami mats or something like that, I don't find that the red is staining my fingers. I also don't see red staining on the ito at all, or not on the ito, on the samegawa, the white samegawa underneath. It looks like it's well treated. Sometimes red is a finicky color, and that isn't the case. There is white samegawa underneath here, and it is relatively small nodule, which is not crazy, but also a little bit disappointing. If you're spending $500 on a sword, you can't really expect a $300 skin of samegawa. At the same time, I wouldn't have minded seeing something other than like the smallest nodules that the smallest nodule options out there. The ito is worth noting that it is tight, and I would say it's not tight in the sense of perfection. If you're going for a really high-end sword, for example, if I were to compare this to a Citadel sword, the Citadel, I feel like I can almost stand on the knots. It's so tight. It's about as close to perfect as you can get. These are like a B, right? It doesn't feel like it's gonna, when I say a B, a grade B, not like B as in it's a bitch. It's suitable in the sense that it moves around a little bit. It feels like at some point in the distant future, it may come loose, but it's not giving me any signs it's going to come loose while I'm using it. I've also used this sword a bit, as I've mentioned, and nothing has come loose. The diamonds are still reasonably well shaped. Everything is still where it's supposed to be. Nothing is loose, which I'm so happy to report, because in some of the other Dragon King and Hanwei swords I've talked about in the past, that has not been the case. And so having tight ito that is consistent and stayed where it's supposed to, it's nice to see that this can be pulled off. I'd be very happy to use a sword like this in terms of overall, in terms of practicing, in terms of comfort, and all of that kind of stuff. It gives me no concerns in terms of longevity or durability. The other bit that I want to note here is the shape of the handle. And this isn't something that I harp on very often because it doesn't really resonate or strike me to comment on it. But this has a really kind of thin ovoid shape, and it indexes exceptionally well. So it rests between my hands. I feel like I know exactly where the edge is, and it really locks in. I think this shape is a very healthy marriage for big, fat North American hands, but also giving this slender, elegant feeling. So they've really refined the shape to make it sizable, but at the same time not too skinny or dainty, and it's really, really nice. And the kind of teardroppy shape that it has throughout the shape of the handle really feels comfortable and locks into my hand in a way that I didn't expect, but was noticeable. And it's not something that I notice on a lot of swords. This one has it, and it's absolutely a feature. If you're a practitioner and you want a comfortable instrument to use for your study, this feels very controllable and very secure in the hand. Coupled with the tight ito, it's overall a very pleasant experience. I say that, and it's something I harp on, because if your ito gets loose, then you don't feel in control of the weapon. And also, if it doesn't secure in your hand or it's too round, it's not that you can't maneuver the thing. It's just that it's uncomfortable. And when you really have something that feels tight in your hand and that you're in control of, it gives you a better experience in using the sword. The other bits I'll note is there are little cherry-themed manuki that are in here, little sakura, little cherry-themed blossoms that are in the manuki. If I move up to the fuchi up here, this little collar, it matches the kasha. Now, Dragon King is very capable of making very nice fittings, and the casting quality on the manuki is quite good. The casting quality on the tsuba, which we'll talk about, is quite good. I have no objection to having very simple fittings here. At the same time, They could have pulled off more cherry blossoms to keep it more thematic. I'm not upset about it at all. At the same time, it does seem a little bit of a missed opportunity. If they're just going to put simple cast fittings on it anyway, why not put some more cherry blossoms on there, show off that capability that Dragon King has that others don't, which is maybe worth talking about. Dragon King is one of the few folks out there that make unique fittings to their models. They're not sold anywhere else. You can only get this cherry blossom tsuba. Well, Dragon King is the one that sells it. Other people might have copied it, but Dragon King is the one that came out with it, and they have some pretty unique tsubas and shapes and artistry that you don't see elsewhere. It's also really well cast. The techniques they use to make these tsuba are very detailed, so nothing really looks muddy. It's not as crisp as it would be if it were a hand-chiseled art object, but then, you know, the tsuba would easily cost 10 times the amount of the whole sword here. As it is, it's very crisp, very clean. I can tell what it is. It looks unique and good. It's just that with that capability, it would be nice to see a little bit more pizzazz in the fittings. That's a purely subjective thing, though. I still like that the fittings are not overly ambitious. I'm talking out of both sides of my mouth here. On one hand, I like that they pulled off what they set out to. They're simple and elegant, and they're doing the job well, and they don't stand out or do anything wrong. At the same time, Dragon King just seems very capable of doing excellent work here, and it seems a missed opportunity to showcase that, if that makes sense. Anyway, the Fuchi is well fit. There's a little bit of a ledge here and there, but no hot spots, nothing that really stands out. And while there is a ledge, it's very nitpicky and not something that I would harp on for a sword in this price point. If we were talking about a $5,000 sword, maybe I would have a little bit more grievance, but I don't. And even at a much higher price point, honestly, I'd be okay with it. As I move down, there are seppa on here. I don't talk about seppa very much. These are the little washers between the Fuchi and the tsuba, the guard, and then the tsuba and the habaki. Dragon King just uses a little bit different looking seppa. Oftentimes these are parts that I see used over and over and over again on swords, and seeing even just a different tooth pattern in here shows me that they're using their own parts, and it's something that I like to see. That brings me to the tsuba. This is a cherry blossom theme. It's pretty out of both sides. It has a very neat looking cherry pattern. On the side that touches your hands, it's less ornate, which is a little weird. The open cherry blossom would be what I would think you would want to have showing outward, right? At the same time, that's not how the sword is designed. And the outward facing one is a little bit rougher on my hand, so I kind of get it. From a user perspective, the back side of this tsuba is very smooth, very comfortable to use. It's also really, I don't know, just a blooming flower is a very unique take on a tsuba. It's well executed here, and one of my favorite features on this sword. I think it really ties things together here. The Spring Sakura is just a really elegant looking sword, and it seems to be something that people enjoy the look of quite a bit. I've had a lot of people, both men and women, that really kind of are drawn to this particular sword and really like the overall theme. I'm more of a swirly Mitsudon guy myself, but I will admit that this is a very appealing sword visually. It's tied together. It's simple and elegant and detailed, and it's really a very well designed and well executed theme on the overall package of sword. Moving from there, I'm going to talk about this transition. It's great. The transition between the Fuchi and then the Koiguchi area over here, there's no bulbous ledges or anything like that. It's overall quite well done. If I talk about the habaki as well, this is something that I would love to see change with Dragon King a little bit, just because I think they have the potential to. It's a simple habaki. It's got a silver color to it, at least. I like that they're not just throwing brass bits on here, so that much is very appreciated. At the same time, it doesn't have any adornments. It'd be nice to see, you know, some little bit of zazz on here with the Spring Sakura theme. The tension is overall really well fit, and just a simple push of the thumb will displace or take the sword out. It doesn't rattle if I shake it. It's very well tensioned and fit in the scabbard as well. The habaki doesn't rattle. It looks nice. It's just an opportunity to, again, showcase some of the capability Dragon King has. And while I don't mind it, it seems on the plain side. And when you're a dork like me with hundreds of swords, seeing the same habaki starts to get a little irritating. I always appreciate it when they do something a little different in that area. Before moving to the blade, I'll talk about the scabbard. So I did touch on a few things, and that the tension is good and that it doesn't rattle. It doesn't rattle anywhere. It's extraordinarily well fit. This is really quite an excellent fitting sword. It's a simple black gloss scabbard. It shows fingerprints. As a dojo user, that's sometimes irritating, but it's not the end of the world. I don't think they make an offer with, or a sword option with ishime as a scabbard. It's only this black gloss. At the same time, it's certainly handsome looking. The tsuba and the fittings are a little bit more satiny colored though, so I think the sword would also be handsome with an ishime style fitting, and I honestly wouldn't mind if there were some cherry blossoms kind of running down the sword. Just again, a capability that I know Dragon King has. It would probably up the price of the sword significantly, but I wouldn't mind it. There are other endearing things about this saya, though, and something that I'm really happy to see that I don't recall seeing previously, and that is this taper. So the sword is pretty thick right at the koiguchi, the mouth area of the sword, and then it tapers down and thins out, and this saya has dimension, which is just tickles me to see, because so often swords don't have this feature until you really go up in price, and even swords in the $1,000 price point that try to pull it off don't taper particularly well. They tend to be too aggressive, or it doesn't go well, or they're too thin. This is one of the best shaped scabbards that I've seen outside of swords in the $1,000 or $2,000 price point. It's very well fit, very well tensioned. It draws and sheathes really, quite quietly as well. It's not raspy as I move it in. It's really, really well fit, and that made it very nice to train with. It wasn't raspy when I moved it around. It didn't make a bunch of noise, and it was just very kind of elegant feeling. It also has that ovoid kind of elliptical shape. It feels solid in my hand. I know right where the edge is. It makes it very easy to control while you're trying to do iaido. What it's missing though are horn parts. So I don't see horn on the koiguchi area here. I don't think the kurigata is made of horn, or the kurigata down here. Now there is some sort of substance around it, some sort of plastic or resin or something like that is going to hopefully help hold the saya together, but it's not as nice as seeing horn parts on it. The shirodome here, though, are placed in and set and glued in. They're not moving around, so when I went to pull the sageo and untie it to practice with, they didn't pull out and start scratching the saya. Tip of my hat there. They're also silver, which matches the same color as the manuki, the seppa, the shirodome on the kashira down here, the little pommel end bit. So there's no extra little bits or coloring that's thrown in. The consistency here is also appreciated, and it certainly contributes to a very consistent and elegant and well executed theme. So anyway, what I'm seeing so far is really quite nice. I like the overall presentation and execution on the fitting so far, and for $500, that's again not a lot in the grand scale for swords, but it is certainly, there's a lot of options. There's a lot of competition here. And what I can say is that this sword, I can't speak for all of them, and that it wasn't the impression I got on the previous spring Sakura examples. But if this is an example of what Dragon King is putting out today, I'm really quite pleased with it. This is some of the best execution that I've seen from Dragon King in the collection that I've had, and the samples that I've had from them. And it's really well put together. It kind of rivals some of the things that I've seen from Shadow Dancer in terms of fitment and quality and how well it fits. Overall, really quite good. Anyway, if I move on to the blade, pointy stabby part, we have a Shinogi Zakuri style blade with a bohi, and then there is a Kisaki on here that has a Yokote, but it's very minor. Doesn't have kind of an offset or an opaque look to it. So it's there, but it's quite a bit more minor. There is some distal taper. I'll put measurements in the description down below for those of you that are interested. The blade is elegant and nice, and it has, not a lot of ripples in the surface, which is very pleasant to see. There's some rippling in the bohi. It's straight and consistent and set in the handle correctly. It's quite sharp, not as super sharp as it could be, but really overall quite sharp, and it has the profile where a little bit of honing will probably get it to snap pool noodles apart a bit better. At the same time, the polish is subtle. So for $500, you can now get polishes that are emulating sashikomi style polishes, in that they have a very kind of bright looking hamon. The Kisaki is polished in such a way where it has kind of a transition and an opaqueness that gives a stark contrast to your eye, and is really quite pretty. So the polish, I don't think, really holds up to some of the other polishes on some of the sword competition that is out there today. There's also plenty of swords that have a terrible polish for $500. I'm just saying that All of the features and consistency that I'm seeing on the rest of the sword are generally here on the blade. It's well made, but it doesn't have that kind of spit shine that some of the competition does today. What's under here, though, is a hamon, which is very pleasant and has kind of an erratic shape, but you got to get it in just the right light to really see it. At the same time, it also doesn't have what I used to see on some Hanwei blades and some Dragon King blades, and that is that the Kasaki would flare out a little bit. So as I was moving this around, I can hear it. It has a bohee. It's light and easy to move around. It's easy to generate tip speed, but I didn't hear it so much. So those are some observations that I would note about the blade. As it is, though, it's very handsome. It has a differentially hardened blade. There's more to look at here than there used to be on the previous through hardened model, which had a kind of a satiny polish and obviously no hamon or anything like that to look at. It'd be nice if they offered a through hardened option, a differentially hardened option, and then maybe some of the folded higher end options on the sword as well, because the set of fittings is really appealing. And I think it'd be nice if a bunch of different options, if the blade were offered in a few different varieties. The rest of the package, I think, warrants that, though. Again, I mentioned it'd be nice to have some higher end fittings like buffalo horn on here, but the shaping, the Ito tightness, this kind of cherry blossom fitting on here, all are very appealing, and it would be nice to have this offered on a higher end folded blade if you were interested in a zazzier polish and some more metallurgical effects to look at. As it is, it's pretty simple, but well executed for what it is. Now I'll talk about the experience of doing Iaido with the sword, and it might not surprise you that it was overall quite pleasant. The Ito is sufficiently tight, the scabbard fits particularly well, and everything was quiet as I moved it around. This was, for $500, really an exceptional feeling sword. Not a lot of swords outside some obscure examples and some nicer pieces from Shadow Dancer have really given me the same level of refinement that this sword does. It's overall been very, very nice. The Ito being sufficiently tight made me feel in control. The shaping of the handle was really exceptional, and again, just made me feel like I knew exactly where the edge was, made me feel safe doing things faster and pushing myself a little bit in training in a way that maybe I wouldn't have if the handle didn't feel as secure as it did in my hand. The scabbard also feels really well. It's very quiet. It was an excellent training tool and companion to try to learn with. My only complaint would be that I didn't hear it as well. If the Kasaki flared a little bit, it would help with the noise levels. But as it is, I could hear it. It just was a little bit quieter than what I would have liked to have. As it is, though, very fun to maneuver. I don't have any concerns or complaints about it. There's nothing really to remedy or fix here. Honestly, as a practitioner's tool, this was very, very pleasant. If you are looking for a sharp sword to train with and $500 is your budget, this is elegant looking and feels pretty solid in the hand. I was very surprised at how pleasant this sword was to move around. It's not the lightest sword out there, but just the way it feels, it's a very user-friendly sword. It's very ergonomic and very comfortable in a way that was surprising. I recall my experience with the previous Spring Sakura swords with other Dragon King swords I've had, and this is by far the best fitment that I've seen from Dragon King. It was a real treat. If I talk about cutting now, this is where things change around a little bit. So this is a differentially hardened blade, and it didn't come obscenely sharp. So if I go hone the edge a little bit, I'm sure it's going to do better. As it is, it's sufficient to chop pool noodles apart. It's sufficient to chop water bottles apart. I didn't get a chance actually to test it on tatami mats, but a fellow student and dojo mate at class did get a chance to break this out and use it on some tatami, and it was certainly up to the task. It's very capable as a cutter, but it's on the lighter side, so you have to get that tip speed up. And if you want to do EI with it, it might be a little bit more comfortable, but it's not a sword that's going to do a lot of the work for you. Dragon King seems to have a few offerings that are in that old Hanwei XL style geometry. They're a little bit wider. Those will do a little bit more of the work for you. This, you have to have good technique. You have to have the right speed and power behind it to make it through, especially used Japanese tatami mats. I also cut water bottles that are debatably abusive here in that they were partially frozen. So there are big chunks of ice in the middle of these water bottles because my garage is not completely warm. It freezes and then unfreezes, and so you're getting a mix of water and a mix of ice. But suffice to say, the sword is still straight and still sharp and not chipped after doing all of the things that I've done with it to the point of recording in this video. I haven't pushed it to failure. I haven't done anything obscenely abusive, but I've cut some branches. I've cut some logs. I've cut some ice blocks and things like that, and the sword overall has held up and hasn't given me any grief. It's still basically in the same shape as it was when it came out of the box, plus a few scratches from from the privilege of cutting those targets. But it's held up well, just as I would expect. It's supposedly made out of 5160. I say that because that is what is advertised, but I don't have a way of validating it. That's a sword that's known to be a pretty solid, available steel to work with, and is known to do good stuff. It's not anything crazy or remarkable, but when it's used by somebody who knows how to work with it, it's very capable of making a durable sword, and that's what I'm seeing here. All right, sword friends, you have seen close-ups of the bits and bobs and fits and features. You've seen me cut with it. You have seen me do EI with it. You've heard my thoughts on the subject. Hopefully at this point, you have enough to decide if it is worth your hard-earned money or not. And it's time for me to answer that question myself. Do I think it's worth the asking price? Well, considering you can get these for around $450, $500, I would say yes. And I'm hesitant on that a little bit, only because I think of the previous version that I had. And the previous version was, I mean, granted, it's been a number of years, inflation is rough, and it was a lower line model. At the same time, I want to say when I reviewed it, it was in like the 300-ish something dollars. So now being close to $500 here, that's quite a step up. And just a differentially hardened blade in my mind doesn't justify that. What justifies it to me, though, is all of the improvements that I've seen. This is the best Dragon King sword that I've had the opportunity to play with. It is nipped and tucked and fit in a way that is just beyond the things that I have seen from Dragon King in the past, and that just could be my luck, but this is really quite a good example. The Fujikasha are on there real well. There's no looseness of the Ito. The shaping of the scabbard and handle are excellent, and kind of, I can't think of a sword that has a better shaped handle for the amount of money. I can think of some swords that might have marginally tighter Ito, but this is still in the running for kind of best in class for this price point. The nipped and tucked features are really important to me as a practitioner, and I was very surprised, frankly, to see how well fit this one was, and how fun it was to use as a tool to practice EI. It was just overall quite a joy. It's not the easiest sword to move around in the sense of like an EI toe, but it is on the lighter side. It cuts reasonably well if your technique is good. I feel like if you're primarily doing EI, it's a great sword with occasional cutting, but if you're exclusively using this to cut tatami mats, you may want something a little bit beefier, unless you are specifically looking for something lighter that isn't going to do you any favors. As it is, I think it could be a little sharper. I wouldn't mind seeing some horn parts on there. I wouldn't mind seeing some zhuzhing of the polish. But as it is, it was an absolutely excellent training tool with a lot of things nipped and tucked. So yes, I would say for $450. Very long-winded way of saying yes. I think it's worth it because of that level of attention to detail I have not seen in the past, and that frankly still is quite rare. As I compare this to other swords at $500, I'm thinking of some of the Shadow Dancer swords that I would compare it to, that I think I would be quite wishy-washy on which one I would prefer, because the Shadow Dancers have less ornate fittings. The shaping of the handle isn't as pleasant as this one is, but the Ito is a little tighter. The polish is a little nicer. Sometimes the blades show a little bit more detail. The fittings also are pleasant enough, but they're not as unique as the stuff from Dragon King. So there's pros and cons there. But there's plenty of other swords I could think of in this price point that are just not as well fit together and don't offer the same features, the same attention to detail as this one does. It's really quite compelling if you value those things. Anyway, those are my thoughts. I had a lot of fun training with it. If that's your aim, I think you would probably like it too. If you're not training with it, it's not the most feature-rich katana out there, but I do think it's a great example of an elegantly made sword that is made by a capable manufacturer, and that has, I'm very happy to say, it looks like they're improving and doing a little bit more nipping and tucking than they used to. Anyway, those are my thoughts. Hopefully you found it helpful. I want to offer again a special thanks to the folks at Cast Siberia for sending this my way for review. I hope you found it useful. Cheers, and thanks for watching.